This is CSCE 120, Learning to Code. This is a module on manipulating data. The first part, we'll be discussing variables. In particular, we'll be discussing how to declare and use variables in JavaScript. We'll talk about basic syntax and assignment operators so that you can put values into your variables. We'll also talk about variable naming rules and conventions. As a review, we'll review the various types of values that you can place into variables, and we'll end with a discussion on variable scoping, which will come in handy later on. A variable is a way to store data. It's somewhat similar to a mathematical variable. Like when you write x, x can take on any number of values like 0, 1, -10, 3.14, etc. A variable has a name, which we sometimes refer to as an identifier, and it can hold a value. It's very similar to the key-value data pair sets that we looked at when we looked at JSON, JavaScript object notation, where you had a key mapping to a value. In this case, the name of a variable is the key, and the value is the value stored in the variable. In JavaScript, you can create a variable using the keyword var, which is short, of course, for variable. You then provide a variable name. Optionally, you can assign a value as an initial value using an assignment operator, which in most programming languages, as in JavaScript, we use a single equal sign followed by a value, also called a literal. Then we end the variable declaration with a semicolon. As a full example, consider the following code snippet. We declare a variable called pi and set it equal to have an initial value of 3.14. Note what assignment here means. It means that the value on the right-hand side, which could also be an expression, is placed and stored into the variable on the left-hand side. Before we look at full demonstration, note that you can also print variables and messages to the console using console.log. In Light Table, the console is viewable at the bottom. To make it viewable, you can go up to View and select Console. In my Light Table, I go up to View, select Console, and the console now appears at the bottom. Let's go ahead and write some variables. First, we can create a variable without an initial assignment by just simply typing var and the variable name, var x. As another example, we could type var number of students and set it equal to an initial value of 30. Another example, suppose that we want to create a floating point number, var interest rate, and we can set it equal to 0.05, indicating 5%. As a final example, let's go ahead and create a variable that holds a string type, var first name. My first name is Chris. Remember that a string is denoted by either single quotes or double quotes. Note each time I used the equal sign to assign a value to the variable, and I used a semicolon at the end of each statement. Let's make sure that these all work by printing them out to the console. Remember that we can use console.log and then provide the variable name to get the variable value, which will be printed down here at the bottom of the console. Number of students. When I evaluate this, down at the bottom, the value 30 is printed because that's the value being stored in the variable number of students. Likewise, interest rate holds a value of 0.05, so when I evaluate it, it's 0.05. And finally, when I print the value of first name, Chris is printed. In JavaScript, variable names must follow several rules. First, they may contain upper and lowercase letters, digits, underscores, and $signs in any combination. However, they may not begin with a digit. You can also not use any reserved words, such as var, which we already used for variable, for, function, and many other reserved words that are reserved by the language itself. For a complete list, see the link at the bottom. Variable names are also case sensitive. If I write total, all lowercase, versus total with an uppercase T to start out with, versus total, all uppercase, these are three completely different variables. There are also several variable naming conventions that you should follow for best practice. Avoid using underscores and $signs in your variable names. You should also use lower camel casing. In multi-word variable names, the first word is lowercased, with each subsequent word the first letter being uppercased. You should also use descriptive names. Name your variables for what they're modeling and what they represent. Code should be self-documenting. Somebody else reading your code shouldn't have to guess as to the purpose of your variable names. Some examples. Some illegal variable names would include interest rate with a space between them. Variable names cannot contain white space. Another example of an illegal variable name would be 95 Theses. Recall that they cannot begin with numbers. Another illegal variable name would be for, because it's a reserved word that's used by the language itself. Bad variable names would include cryptic variable names like variable 01, or nonsensical words like foo, or my variable. It's also bad to mix your casing, so number of students with some letters uppercase and some letters lowercase would also be bad. Good variable names follow the conventions that we mentioned before. Average, subtotal, grand total, tax rate, all following the lower camel case convention. Recall that JavaScript has several different variable types, including numeric types, which include integers and floating point numbers, fractional numbers, strings, booleans, which can take on the value of true or false, objects, and arrays. JavaScript is a dynamically typed language, so a variable's type is determined by the value that's assigned to it. It can change if you change the value that you assign to it. It's not set for the life of the variable. You can also use the keyword typeof to determine a variable's type. Let's take a look at an example. I've created a variable x and set it equal to an initial value of 10. I then use typeof x. It's a number. I can change the value of x by reassigning it. Let's reassign it to a string, ten. Now let's do typeof again. And it's changed into a string. I can set it to an object. We'll set it to an empty object for now and ask what its type is. It's an object. Let's create another variable, a Boolean variable called isFaculty, and set it equal to initially to true. We can also create variables to hold objects. Let's create a student object that has a first name, a last name, and a GPA. Finally, let's create an array. I'll initially create it to hold integers 10, 20, and 30. I can change it later to hold different elements by reassigning its value. Now it holds a collection of 3 different strings: hello, world, and exclamation point. To conclude, the scope of a variable is the part of a program in which a variable is valid, also referred to as in scope. A variable declared inside of a function, which we'll look at later, is local to that function. A variable declared outside of a function is called a global. All the variables that we just wrote in all the demonstrations are global. If you try to write a variable without the var keyword, it automatically makes a global variable, and that should be avoided. For now, just keep in mind that you should always use the var keyword when creating your variables.